In the autumn of 1898, a mining crew working a secondary shaft on the eastern slope of the Black Hills drove a charge of dynamite into what they believed was a stubborn granite intrusion, blocking their advance toward a promising ore seam. The blast did not clear the rock. It opened it. What the foreman's log described in the hours that followed was not a vein, not a void left by earlier extraction operations, not the collapsed remnant of a natural cavern formed by water dissolving softer mineral inclusions over geological time. The language the foreman used, in the single surviving entry from that shift before the report, was confiscated by a representative of the Homestake Mining Company 4 days later, was deliberate and specific in a way that suggested he understood its implications as he wrote it. He recorded that the chamber behind the broken stone was dressed, that its walls had been worked, that the floor showed no evidence of natural formation. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. And that at its far end, set into the carved wall at a position he described as central to the chamber's long axis, were objects he did not have language to describe in terms any shift report was designed to accommodate. The shaft foreman's name was August Reinhardt. He had come to the hills from the copper country of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where he had spent his early working years in shafts cut into the native copper deposits around Keweenaw, some of the most extensively mined prehistoric copper terrain on the continent. He had accumulated 22 years in excavation work of one kind or another across 2 countries before arriving at Homestake, and he had never encountered in any of that time, by his own account set down in a private letter preserved by his daughter and donated to the Lawrence County Historical Society in 1953, anything that resembled what he found below the broken granite on the morning of the 3rd of November, 1898. The letter was never cited in any published account of Homestake's operational history. The chamber was sealed within a week of its discovery. The official record of its existence does not exist. The Black Hills are among the oldest exposed geological formations on the North American continent. The Precambrian granite core of the range, pushed upward through younger sedimentary strata by tectonic processes that geologists have traced to pressures operating across hundreds of millions of years, reaches depths estimated at 2.5 billion years in age, placing the bedrock of the hills among the most ancient surface-accessible material yet formally dated on the landmass. The Lakota people, whose oral tradition holds the hills as the center of the world and as the origin point of the people's relationship to the earth, have names for formations within the range that correspond with a precision that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence to geological features the United States Geological Survey did not formally catalogue until the 1880s and 90s. The Lakota name for the Black Hills, Paha Sapa, does not translate accurately as the English rendition most commonly given in settler-era accounts. The name carries within it a description not merely of the hill's surface appearance but of what lies beneath the visible surface, a reference to the interior of the earth as a place that holds its own record, separate from the sky record and the water record, older than both, and not accessible to those who approach the hills only as a surface to be mapped. When Black Elk, the Oglala Lakota holy man whose account was recorded by the poet John Neihardt in 1931, described the hills as the heart of everything that is, the institutional response to that statement was to classify it as religious metaphor. His listeners interpreted the claim in the framework they brought to it, which was the framework of a civilization that had decided the ground was a resource to be extracted, rather than a record to be read. The oral tradition of the Lakota and the Cheyenne both include accounts of chambers within the hills that predate any human construction the traditions themselves describe. Spaces within the rock that were not carved by the people who found them, but were found already made, already finished, already present in the granite, as a fact about the hills that the arriving peoples were expected to inherit and to protect. These accounts were collected sporadically by ethnographers working in the region through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and in each case the same institutional response followed. The accounts were classified as mythological, filed under the category of spiritual narrative rather than geographical testimony, and set aside from the bodies of evidence, the United States Geological Survey and the Bureau of American Ethnology were constructing about the region's physical character and prehistoric occupation. What the oral record described as physical fact, the institutional record absorbed as metaphor and proceeded without it. The gold rush that followed George Armstrong Custer's 1874 expedition into the Black Hills remade the region's relationship to federal institutional attention within a period of 4 years. The expedition itself was a direct violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, which had guaranteed Lakota sovereignty over the hills in perpetuity. The guarantee held for 6 years. When Custer's expedition geologist reported gold in the stream gravels of French Creek, the treaty's perpetuity contracted to the length of time it took the Grant administration to decide the hills were worth taking, which was not long. The Homestake Mine, established in 1876 by a syndicate that included the California mining financier George Hearst, father of the future newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst, became within a decade the largest gold-producing operation in North America. By 1898, the year of the blast that opened Reinhardt's chamber, Homestake was extracting ore from a shaft network that extended more than 1,000 feet below the surface across a horizontal spread of several square miles, employing several hundred men across multiple shifts and generating revenues that had by that point returned tens of millions of dollars to the Hearst interests. The mine's operational records from this period are among the more detailed surviving documents from the extractive industry of the American West. The company maintained logs of every blast sequence, every shift change, every significant geological encounter, every equipment failure and its resolution. Those records, held in the Bancroft Library at the University of California at Berkeley as part of the George Hearst collection, are accessible to researchers. The entry for the 3rd of November 1898, the date Reinhardt's own log places the blast that opened the chamber, is absent from the bound operational volume. The pages covering the 4 days between the 3rd and the 7th of November have been physically removed. The binding of the volume shows clear evidence of that removal in the cut stubs still visible along the interior spine when the volume is held open to the relevant section. The Bancroft Library's accession record for the collection, filed at the time of donation in 1941, lists the volume as complete and unaltered. No researcher working in the collection appears, in any published work, to have noted the missing pages or the evidence of their removal. What the geology of the Black Hills suggests about the region's human timeline, independent of the question of Reinhardt's chamber, is itself a record the institutional consensus has chosen to note without pursuing. The hills have served as a source of copper, gold, and high-quality siliceous stone for human populations since at minimum the end of the last glacial period, when the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet opened the interior of the continent to movement and sustained habitation. Archaeological excavations conducted across the surrounding region and the broader upper Midwest through the mid-20th century identified copper artifacts in burial contexts and stratified deposits now dated by radiocarbon methods applied to associated organic material to what researchers call the Old Copper Culture, a complex of mining and metalworking activity centered in the Lake Superior Basin and the Great Lakes region that current estimates place between 5,000 and 8,000 years before the present. The Old Copper Culture is one of the most persistently underexamined anomalies in the consensus account of North American prehistory. Its practitioners produced copper tools, weapons, and ornamental objects of extraordinary technical refinement, including fishhooks, awls, projectile points, and ceremonial objects whose dimensions and surface treatment reflect sustained and skilled craft practice, at a period when the standard account of the continent's human populations places them in pre-metalworking subsistence patterns without the organizational capacity for systematic mineral extraction. The copper they worked was not smelted. It was cold-worked and annealed from nodules and sheets of native copper found at or near the surface in the Keweenaw Peninsula deposits and in related outcrops across the Great Lakes region, hammered and shaped and heat-treated through a process whose results the Smithsonian Institution's own field investigators in the 1880s described, in language the institution's published reports subsequently moderated, as comparable in dimensional precision to the output of trained European metallurgists. The source deposits for this copper network extend through the Lake Superior Basin and into the mineral-bearing strata of the Black Hills and the surrounding region. The distribution map of old copper artifacts, when plotted against the known copper deposit geography of the upper Midwest, describes a trade and extraction network operating at continental scale across thousands of years. That network has no recognized origin point in any consensus archaeological framework, no named people associated with it in any account the discipline has pursued with sustained institutional attention, and no satisfactory published explanation for its disappearance from the archaeological record, roughly 3,000 years before European contact. The question has been sitting in the published literature since the late 19th century. The institutional response has been to classify it as anomalous and to await the further investigation that would eventually explain it, which has not come. The Black Hills sit within what geologists classify as the Harney Peak Granite Complex, a formation whose pegmatite intrusions have produced not only gold and silver, but rare minerals and crystalline structures that differ in composition from the surrounding Precambrian substrate in ways that suggest geological processes operating under pressures and temperatures not fully accounted for by the standard model of the range's formation history. The hill's mineral wealth was known to the peoples of the surrounding plains long before Custer's geologist confirmed it for the audiences waiting in the east. The Arikara and the Mandan, whose villages along the Missouri River served as the primary trade nodes for the Upper Plains economy well into the 19th century, maintained accounts of exchange networks that drew copper and stone from the hills over distances that the Bureau of American Ethnology's published reports consistently described as implausible for pre-contact populations. The implausibility the Bureau identified was a reflection of what the institution believed those populations were capable of, which was less than what the material evidence of the exchange networks themselves demonstrated. The copper found in burial mounds at Cahokia, the great ceremonial center in the American Bottom near present-day St. Louis, has been traced by spectrographic analysis to sources in the Lake Superior Basin. Cahokia's peak occupation spans roughly 900 to 1200 of the Common Era. The copper in its burial deposits traveled more than 1,000 miles from its source to its final placement. The argument that the people who built Cahokia, who constructed earthen platform mounds reaching heights of 100 feet across a planned urban grid extending several square miles, could not have maintained organized extraction and trade networks that reached the Black Hills is not an argument the physical evidence supports. It is an argument the institutional consensus required. August Reinhardt's letter to his daughter does not concern copper, it concerns stone. The fourth page of the letter, which his daughter marked separately in the family's keeping with a pencil notation in the margin, describes what he encountered in the chamber with the specificity of a man trained to read rock formation by occupation rather than by academic instruction. He writes of walls smooth in a way he associates with long water action, but showing, when examined at close range with a lamp, the fine parallel marks of deliberate finishing, marks arranged in consistent direction across the face of the stone in a pattern he describes as purposeful. He describes a ceiling whose height he estimates at 12 feet across the chamber's central section, a height consistent with the proportions of a constructed interior rather than a natural cavern, whose ceiling height in granite formation would vary irregularly with the stress fractures of the rock. He notes a floor showing a level surface across its full width, approximately 30 feet as he paces it, with a precision he describes as unlikely to result from natural process in a granite formation. He estimates the chamber's depth from the blast point at approximately 40 feet. He describes no connecting passage, no secondary opening, no evidence that the space had been accessed from any direction he could determine. His description of the objects at the far wall is the section his daughter noted separately. She wrote in the margin that her father never described those objects in any subsequent conversation she had with him across the remaining years of his life. He told her only, when she pressed him on the letter before he left for Colorado, that they were made and that they should not have been there by any account he had of who had been in that country and when. The letter does not use the word ancient. It uses the phrase older than anything. Reinhardt was not a man given to dramatic framing by any description his daughter or any other source provides of him. The phrase appears once and is not elaborated. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Homestake Mining Company's response to whatever Reinhardt's crew reported in the first 4 days of November 1898 is traceable in the record as a sequence of operational consequences rather than any documented deliberate decision. The entries from those 4 days were removed from the bound operational log that was later deposited at the Bancroft Library. The shift crew assigned to the eastern slope section was reassigned to a different shaft on the mine's western extension within 2 weeks of the blast, a relocation that appears in the company's personnel records without explanatory notation. 3 of the 6 men on Reinhardt's crew left Homestake employment entirely before the end of the calendar year. 1 returned to the Upper Peninsula. 2 are not traceable in subsequent census records or employment directories for the Black Hills region. Reinhardt himself remained with the company for a further 8 months before accepting a transfer to a mine operation in Colorado in July of 1899. He died of a pulmonary condition in Pueblo, Colorado, in the autumn of 1904. He was 44 years old. No formal internal report referencing the chamber appears anywhere in the surviving Homestake documentation held at Berkeley or at any other archive where portions of the company's records have been deposited. The chamber's location, on the eastern slope in the section designated on Homestake's own survey maps as Shaft 19 Extension, was covered by a concrete plug and surface cap whose installation is recorded in the company's construction log for the 15th of November, 1898, which is 12 days after the blast. The log entry describes the work as a structural fill operation following unstable excavation. No unstable excavation is recorded in any adjacent entry for Shaft 19 Extension in the weeks preceding that notation. The plug was poured, the entry was made, the record moved forward without pause. The Bureau of American Ethnology, which had maintained field survey operations in the Black Hills region and the surrounding plains through the 1880s and into the 90s, completed its principal published report on the region's prehistoric inhabitants in 1897, 1 year before Reinhardt's blast. The report, authored by the ethnologist Cyrus Thomas as part of his broader national investigation of North American mound-building cultures, addressed the question of pre-contact human presence in the hills, primarily through surface survey of the accessible terrain east of the granite core. Thomas's published methodology did not extend to the interior geology of the range as a potential site of archaeological significance. The omission was not defended in the published report. It did not arise as a question the institutional framework required him to address. This omission sits in a specific context when read alongside the field correspondence Thomas's colleagues were generating simultaneously. The field notes and letters of James Owen Dorsey, a missionary linguist who had spent years among Lakota communities throughout the region, and whose correspondence with Thomas is preserved in the Smithsonian Institution's National Anthropological Archives, include multiple passages referencing Lakota accounts of interior chambers in the hills that Dorsey described as too geographically specific and too consistent across separate informants of different ages and community affiliations to be dismissed as purely ceremonial narrative. Dorsey noted that the accounts placed the chambers in relation to identifiable landmarks with the kind of locational precision that characterized Lakota geographical knowledge more broadly, knowledge that in other domains had been verified by the surveyors who followed the same routes. He noted that different elders located the chambers in mutually consistent rather than divergent ways, the pattern of transmitted geographical knowledge rather than varying mythological accounts. Thomas's published report incorporated none of this material. In a letter to Thomas dated in the spring of 1895, Dorsey wrote plainly that what he had collected warranted physical investigation and that he intended to recommend as much formally. Thomas did not reply to that section of the letter. No formal recommendation was filed. The Bureau conducted no investigation of the hill's interior geology during the years its field teams were active in the region. The oral record was left in the correspondence files. The physical evidence was left to the mining company to encounter on whatever terms it chose. The Smithsonian Institution's relationship to physical evidence recovered from the Black Hills and surrounding region during the late 19th century is documented piecemeal across several institutional archives, and what that documentation shows is not a systematic campaign of suppression so much as a systematic failure to ask certain questions. The institution's Bureau of American Ethnology, established in 1879 under the directorship of John Wesley Powell, was the primary federal body tasked with the collection and analysis of material evidence relating to North America's prehistoric and indigenous populations. Its mandate was broad, and its resources, by the standards of 19th century science, were substantial. It produced landmark studies of indigenous languages, of mound-building cultures across the Mississippi and Ohio valleys, and of the material culture of the Plains peoples. What it did not produce, across 2 decades of active fieldwork in the Black Hills region, was any formal investigation of what the ground beneath the granite core of the hills might contain. The Bureau's field agents worked the surface. They catalogued what the surface showed. The question of what the surface covered was not one the institution framed as falling within its program, which is to say it was not a question the institution found inconvenient to ask because it never thought to ask it in the first place. The framework the Bureau brought to the region assumed the relevant human timeline in the Black Hills extended back a few thousand years at most, and that its significant features were accessible to surface survey. That assumption shaped what was collected, what was published, and what was formally described as known. The Lakota oral record, which described a different timeline and different features, was available to any Bureau agent who spent time in the region. Dorsey's letters prove it was heard. The question of why it was not pursued leads not to a named decision, but to the structure of an institution that had already decided, before its agents arrived, what the ground was likely to contain. What survives of the material record around the former Shaft 19 extension requires locating across several separate archives. The concrete cap installed in November 1898 appears on Homestake's 20th century survey maps as a decommissioned structural fill, a standard company notation for plugged voids throughout the mine complex. Those survey maps were deposited with the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology in Rapid City following the mine's closure and are accessible to researchers at that institution. A geologist named Harold Vickers examined them in 1978 while conducting a survey of historic mine voids in the Black Hills for the state's Abandoned Minelands program. In his field report, Vickers noted that the plug at the Shaft 19 extension location appeared, from its surface dimensions as recorded on the Homestake map and the accompanying depth notations, to cover a void significantly larger than any standard shaft plug in the mine's documented history. His estimate, derived from the map notation alone without any ground-penetrating survey, placed the covered area at approximately 800 square feet. A standard Homestake shaft plug of this period covers between 20 and 50 square feet. The discrepancy is not marginal. Vickers filed his observation with the South Dakota Department of Environment and Natural Resources as an anomalous notation requiring further review. The file was closed in 1981 with a notation that the location fell within Homestake's active permit boundary and was outside the state program's jurisdiction. The Homestake permit held for another 21 years. The mine ceased active gold extraction in 2002. The property passed to the state of South Dakota and was subsequently developed as the Sanford Underground Research Facility, a physics laboratory that uses the depth and geological stability of the former mine to study dark matter and neutrino physics at depths where surface cosmic radiation is effectively absent. The facility's excavation has reopened significant access throughout the former mine, driving new connection tunnels and restoring historic workings to operational condition. The facility's staff have noted, in published accounts, the periodic discovery of spaces in the rock, that do not appear on any available map of the mine's documented workings. Each such space is described as a previously unmapped mine void. Whether any such space corresponds to the location and dimensions Harold Vickers identified on the Homestake survey map in 1978 is not a question the facility has addressed in any public document. The area of the former Shaft 19 extension falls within a section of the property currently designated as structurally inactive in the facility's operating plan. It is not scheduled for reopening. The Lakota claim to the Black Hills, guaranteed by treaty and violated within 6 years of that guarantee, produced a century of sustained legal action that reached the Supreme Court in 1980. The court ruled the taking illegal. The Lakota Nation declined the monetary award offered in compensation. The land, its leadership stated, was not for sale at any price and had never been. The legal proceedings that produced that ruling accumulated, across decades and multiple rounds of testimony, a formal record that included statements from Lakota elders describing the hill's sacred and historical character in terms that the federal court received as religious testimony and weighed accordingly, which is to say it gave them the weight the legal framework assigns to spiritual rather than geographical claim. The elder testimony described the interior of the hills as a site of historical significance predating the Lakota occupation of the region by a period described consistently as very long and as belonging to a people distinct from the Lakota's own ancestors, but whose presence in the hills the Lakota had inherited the knowledge of and the responsibility for protecting. These were not accounts of spiritual vision. They were transmission of received geographical knowledge across generations. That testimony is in the federal court record. It has not been cited in any published archaeological assessment of the Black Hills region produced by any institution with access to the archive. The regional press of the Black Hills in the years immediately following 1898 is a record that has not been systematically examined for references to Reinhardt's discovery. The Lead and Deadwood newspapers from November and December of that year are held in partial runs at the South Dakota State Historical Society in Pierre. A researcher examining those papers in connection with a study of Homestake's labor history in the early 2000s noted, in an unpublished thesis held at the South Dakota School of Mines Library, a brief item in the Deadwood Pioneer Times from the third week of November 1898, referring to the relocation of a crew from one section of the Homestake workings to another, following what the item described as an unexpected excavation result, requiring company review. The item does not name Reinhardt. It does not identify the shaft section. It runs to 3 sentences on an interior page between mine production statistics and a hardware advertisement. The researcher noted it in a footnote as a minor operational item of no significance to the labor history she was tracing. It is the only contemporaneous public reference to an event at Shaft 19 extension that this record has located. The last trace of August Reinhardt in the Black Hills record is a personnel transfer document in the surviving Homestake files, dated the 12th of July, 1899. It records his destination and gives no stated reason for the transfer. His daughter's letter from that summer, held in the Lawrence County collection in Deadwood, notes that he told her before he left that he had seen something he was not going to speak of, and that the company had made it clear silence was the appropriate course. He did not elaborate. The 4th page of his winter letter from 1899 had already told her as much as he was prepared to say. He died in Pueblo 5 years after he left the hills. His letter is still in the archive in Deadwood, in the collection his daughter's son donated in 1963, in the folder labeled with his name and the dates of his employment at Homestake. The chamber he described is still in the ground beneath the former mine site, sealed under a concrete plug whose installation was entered into the company log as routine structural maintenance on the 15th of November 1898. The Lakota testimony describing spaces in that granite that no miner put there is in the Smithsonian's National Anthropological Archives in the Dorsey correspondence, in the letters the Bureau of American Ethnology's published report did not incorporate. The survey map showing a plug covering 800 square feet of sealed void is in Rapid City at the School of Mines. The physics laboratory built in the shafts below that plug is studying the universe's oldest light in the oldest accessible rock on the continent. In the dark below everything the mine extracted and the company catalogued and the institution decided constituted the full account of what that ground contained. The chamber is still there. What Reinhardt found was not supposed to be there by the account the arriving civilization had already committed itself to. That is precisely why the record was arranged to proceed as though it was not. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.